So we posted. There we go. Welcome everybody. Today we are doing our employment standards workshop in collaboration with the Workers Solidarity Network. This is our second workshop in collaboration with them, and we're really excited about the content for today. Tab, if you can please change to the next slide. I'd like to start with a territorial acknowledgement. Work BC Centers, West Shore and Sooke recognizes the traditional territories of the Esquimalt, Songhees, Sooke, Chinook, and Patcheedaht First Nations on which our offices are located. We are proud to provide employment-related services to these nations. So today we're going to start with a brief overview of Work BC services, and then we'll be handing it over to the Workers Solidarity Network, and they'll be doing the bulk of our workshop on employment standards. And if you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat or wait till the end, and we will have a section for that too. If you think of anything at the end, we'll send out a contact detail so you can reach out to either Work BC or Workers Solidarity Network. So, Work BC services. We offer free employment services, and they are available to all unemployed British Columbians who are seeking employment and are legally eligible to work in BC. Some employed individuals may also be eligible for our services, such as those who are at risk of losing their current job or underemployed British Columbians with a disability. Work BC centers are located across British Columbia, meaning if you register at one and you happen to move, you can kind of just pick up where you left off at a different center. Work BC offers a range of services that support job seekers to improve employment readiness and to find or maintain employment. Additionally, any BC job seeker can access the self-serve resource area of our Work BC Employment Service Centers. So our resource center, it is open to all job seekers. You can come in to use our computers for all your job search needs or access a printer or photocopier for your job search documents. A staff member is available to assist you if you have questions or need assistance, and resource services are provided on a drop-in or appointment basis. Workshops, they are in person at West Shore and Sooke centers. Our workshop cover all aspects of job search and job retention to ensure you achieve your goals. We offer workshops like resume building, career planning, interview skills, hidden job market, computer skills, financial literacy, and more. Wage subsidy. The wage subsidy program is designed to assist unemployed individuals or underemployed individuals to enhance their skills on the job. Wage subsidy assists the employer when hiring someone who lacks all of the necessary skills for a position by offering a percentage of your wages for a duration of up to 24 weeks. Personal employment planning. We provide individualized sessions with an employment advisor to build your return to work action plan, helping you define your path for success. If everyone could just make sure that they are muted, just so we don't get any background noise, that would be great. Job start supports. So you might be eligible for work clothing such as boots or scrubs, tools, and short-term courses such as food safe and first aid can be available for those who are unavailable or unable to afford it, And job sustainment services. Work BC centers offer job sustainment services to help you resolve issues impacting your ability to maintain employment. We can provide on-the-job or in-office support from experienced job coaches. They can help you mediate disputes with your employer, learn new procedures, or gain insight into today's workplace culture. And lastly, job listings and labor market info newsletter. So as a registered client of the West Shore or Sooke Work BC centers, you can receive our newsletter, Job Links. This newsletter features a daily list of job leads, covers local employment information, as well as employment events and programs. So you can head to our website, which is listed below, if you'd like to learn more about our services. Upcoming events. So in April, we will have an information session with Outward Bound Trading Academy. This is an outdoor career training program. It's completely funded. It's a federal program designed to help participants develop social and emotional competencies and skills that are especially relevant in the Canadian outdoor job market. This will serve you no matter where your career takes you. And if you missed our last workshop or want to take a peek at the ones that we've done in the past, you can head over to our YouTube channel. This will be where this workshop will be posted as well. So if you don't happen to write everything down or you want to send it to somebody else, you can check us out there. Otherwise, that is our contact information. I will send it out after the workshop is over too, or you're welcome to stop by either of our centers during our business hours. Otherwise, I will pass it over to Worker Solidarity Network.
Thanks, folks. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. And telling us a little bit about the work that you folks do, of course. Just wait a sec while the PowerPoint loads. And then we can get started. There we go. Awesome, amazing. So welcome to today's Wait Stuff Clinic workshop. My name is Nikki. I'll give a chance to my colleagues to introduce themselves as well. We'll be talking for about an hour today about wait stuff and wait stuff related issues. But before we get started, I just wanted to, well, thank you folks at WorkBC for giving us your land acknowledgement. And I wanted to start myself by just, stating that I'm calling in today from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, otherwise known as Vancouver, but I know there are folks calling in from all over the province. So if you know where you're located and where you're calling in from, I invite everyone who feels comfortable and called to do so to let us know in the chat where you're calling in from as well. So this will be the agenda of the day. I'll just set the container before I pass it on to my colleagues to introduce themselves. Like I said, today's workshop will be about an hour. Some of the information might not be new, some of it might be new. So if you have any questions at all whatsoever, feel free to either raise your hand, like with the chat function, or just go off mute and ask it. If it's like a really lengthy, detailed question, we might save it till the very end. But there will be a chance to have all your questions answered. Or you can just wait until the very end and ask it then. But yeah, for now, like I said, my name is Nikki. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the membership coordinator here at WSN. I'm also one of the legal advocates. So yeah, why don't I pass it to Andrea to introduce herself.
Thanks, Nikki. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrea. I am the program coordinator for our legal advocacy program at Worker Solidarity Network, and I'll be presenting on a few topics today as well. Thanks for coming. And I'll pass it off to Pam.
Thanks, Andrea. Hi, everyone. Delighted to have so many folk join us today. My name is Pamela Shotto. I go by she, her. I'm calling from Sioux Nation territory today. And I'm the interim executive director at the Worker Solidarity Network and also a legal advocate in the legal advocacy program as well.
Nice, that's awesome. One thing I forgot to say is because of the time constraints we have today, we actually don't have a break scheduled. We usually do. The workshop tends to be longer. So if at any point you need to step away from the computer, please go take care of your needs, go to the bathroom, grab a snack or whatever. And you certainly don't have to be, as folks already said, on camera or on mute or anything. So be as comfortable as you'd like. So a little bit about us. If you haven't heard of the Worker Solidarity Network, we're an organization and we work with and consist of non-unionized and precarious workers across the province. We advocate for the rights and interests of workers, specifically the wage non-unionized workers, while taking collective action to improve labor standards for all. So we kind of do this in a three-pronged approach. The first one is in through, like, I don't know, modes exactly like this, through Know Your Rights educations, through workshops, distributing pamphlets, etc. the second way, and that's also kind of tied to today's workshop as well, if this is something that you're interested in, is we actually work directly with individual workers and support them through like navigating their rights, I guess, and specific complaints they may have. So at the Employment Standards branch level, sometimes we can support folks in navigating the early stages of a human rights complaint, or just in general provide some know your rights information directly to workers about their specific situations at work. And then finally, my favorite way that we do this is for campaigning for long-term improvements, which is really at the heart of what we do. So it would be, it's awesome when one worker can get all their wages back. But it's really effective to lobby for and campaign for better labor conditions for all workers. And that obviously is done simultaneously, which is really exciting. So that's about WSN. And I'll pass it to Pam, who will tell us about some of the terms we're going to be using today.
Okay, so we'll be going through many terms throughout the presentation today, and we'll go directly to descriptors and definitions of specific Know Your Rights materials. But some words that you might hear throughout the presentation are wage theft. This is a wage theft clinic, or other known as missing wages. Wage theft is the failure to pay wages or provide employee benefits rightfully owed to an employee by contract of law. Another term that we'll use a lot is the ESA, which is short for the Employment Standards Act, which is law in BC that sets the minimum standards of your rights at work. And we'll go over some of your rights under the ESA today. Another short-term word is the ESB, which is short for the Employment Standards Branch. The ESB administers the Employment Standards Act and regulations, which sets the standards of payment, compensation, and working conditions. And lastly, another word that's commonly used when we're discussing all of the rights that we'll be going through today is contravention. And that's when an act, or the Employment Standards Act, the ESA, that violates the law. And this term is used when your rights are violated at work by the ESB. So this slide's about keeping track and taking note of certain instances that happen at work. We call it Write That Shit Down, which is one of our members and past coworkers who created this template. So if you're ever experiencing any issues at work, it's important to keep track of what's going on. In any case, you want to search or seek for a remedy in the future. It's common for employers not to provide pay stubs. It's common for employers not to keep track of schedules, to keep track of health and safety concerns. So could be, an employee's responsibility to keep track of that in order to seek for a remedy in the future. Some ways to write that stuff down is a date and a time that this took place. It's going to be in a notepad. It's going to be in your notes in your phone, or other forms of ways you want to keep track of things, taking photos. In there, you can write who's present, include anyone who witnessed the interaction, what was said, and maybe even a short note on the impact it may have had on you. You could even text or email yourself or take quick videos or memos on your phone. This is important to write this stuff down because we're humans and we forget things, and in 6 months from now, you might forget an instance that took place, but though that information could be important for a future claim or complaint, or if you're seeking for a remedy in the future. Other ways to do is, notes aren't the only paper trail you should keep. You could take photos or copies of your employment contracts. You could take photos of your schedules, work emails, take photos of work emails or save them. Keep track of your benefit plan, workplace employee manuals. Even if you want to take the extent, once you get hired, to take a photo of your screenshot of the job ad, in any case that they offer you a wage that's lower than what the job ad suggested. So basically, keeping a paper trail of everything is truly important. to address your rights in the workplace in the future. And you could do that in multiple ways. And even if you, even if you're having it verbal, it's always important to have it written. So if you're having a verbal conversation with your manager, I suggest to always follow up an email. That way it's written somewhere, and then you'll have the evidence in the future. And we'll be going through how to write that shit down throughout the presentation for all of the rights that we're going to go through today. So I'll go to the top 7 forms of wage theft that we see at the Worker Solidarity Network. 1, regular wages. 2, unauthorized deductions. 3, tips and gratuities. 4, overtime. 5, statutory holiday pay. 6, compensation for length of service. And 7, vacation pay. And these are all things that you have entitlements to under the ESA, under the Employment Standards Act. And it is really common for employers to contravene your rights under these 7 points here. So we'll go into them. Regular wages. What this means is that you must be paid for all hours for an employer or a business. So this is at the standard rate of what you were offered for in your job contract, which could be, $25 an hour. If that was offered to you, you need to pay that for every hour to work. However, under the Employment Standards Act, you must be paid at least a minimum wage, which is $15.65, unless you have an agreement of a higher wage. Some ways that we see the regular wage regulation in the Employment Standards Act being contravened is sometimes you get asked to work 15 minutes later. If that happens, you need to be paid for that extra 15 minutes. Sometimes you get asked by an employer to pick up materials or pick up an employee on your way to work or after work. You need to be paid for that time because it benefits the business. If you're asked to work during your break, it's common for employers to contravene the act and not pay you for the time that you're working your break. If you're asked to show up to work 15 minutes early, sometimes employers ask you to change at work or count your cash till before your shift unpaid. That's illegal. You need to be paid for it. Driving from one work site to another work site during a working day, you must be paid for that as regular wages. And if you're showing up to work and being sent home before 2 hours, you need to be paid regular 2 hours of work. How to write that shit down, similar like I said earlier, in order to demonstrate the hours that you worked, take a photo of your schedule. That could be one way to keep track of that information. You could also keep a copy of your punch-out slip if that's something that is in operations within your workplace. And you'll have the direct information of the hours that you worked. Or even at the end of your shift, write down when you started work and when you ended work. That way you have your information, because schedules do change sometimes and you might have worked way longer than what your schedule actually provided. How to calculate that? If you're trying to seek remedy, you take the hours of work times your hourly pay. And there's an example there. So times $15.65 times $4, 4 hours, $62.60. And that would be the amount that you'd be entitled for under the Employment Standards Act. Next, we'll go into tips and gratuities. This is often an entitlement that takes place when you work in the restaurant or hospitality, hotels, fast food, multiple ways where you could be provided with gratuities. And tips are a payment voluntarily made or left by an employee or to an employee by a customer, in the circumstances that it's reasonable to assume that gratuity was left for the worker and not the employer. So your rights within the section of the act that protects your gratuities, which is a new legislation that was put in 2018. So your employers may not share in tips unless they do similar work to the employees who receive tips. So, at the WSN, we often hear that employers are dipping their paws in the pots of service workers. But in reality, employers can only do that if they're doing the same amount of work. And same would mean, you know, if they're dishwashing throughout a shift or something like that. Oops. Employers cannot deduct business costs from a tip pool or from tips to which an employer has access to. So oftentimes, you know, you, as a person who works in the industry, you'll get gratuities and cash, but the tips distributed in debits and credits is often administered by the administration at a later date. So your employer can't deduct from your tips if you accidentally like made a mistake on a food dish, for example. An employer may not charge an employee for costs such as dine and dash. Yeah. So even another example was if you broke something at work, they can't take it out of your tips. And then look out for house tip outs during a tip pool or a tip out. So sometimes house tip out means that they're taking a percentage of your gratuities to be giving to the house. House usually means in the restaurant world, management, administration, employers. So when that, if you see that, it's typically, they might be contravening the Employment Standards Act because employers can't be diving into that unless they do similar work. How to keep track of tips and gratuities, it's a bit difficult because it's still a very ambiguous way, and administratively in terms of operations, it's not really kept track a lot in the restaurant through operations in the restaurants. But some examples is you keep a copy of your cash out reports or sales reports, and on there typically it says what your tip out would be, or you could write down the tip amount provided on the sales report on a side note right beside your hours of work, for example. That way, when you know when you receive your tip out at the end of the week, you could compare that to make sure that you got the right amount. You could write down an estimate of your sales if you don't have access to a sales report at the end of the night. Or even in the event of a tip pool, you keep records of the amount of tips received in, like, let's say when you get your tip out at the end of the week, write down the amount of tips that you received. And that way you could use that as an example in the future if you don't receive any gratuities at all, for instance, and it would reflect how much you made in the past and how much you should be making now, roughly. And calculations, ways, you know, if you're claiming gratuities and you don't know how much you'd be entitled to, you could make an estimate of your sales, and you could do an estimate of gratuities between 18 and 20% and make that calculation. And that could be what you could claim and assume to the best of your knowledge what you'd be entitled to. Pass it to you, Nikki.
Thanks, Pam. So Pam kind of hinted at what is called unauthorized deductions with regard to tips, but I'll get into what it is. It's actually pretty intuitive. The term itself might not be familiar, but it itself is a pretty intuitive concept. So basically, unauthorized deductions are deductions that an employer might take from your pay, or even from your tips, but specifically here we're talking about wages that they're not supposed to be. So employers must not directly or indirectly withhold, deduct, or require payment of all or part of an employee's wages for any purpose. And they also must not require you to pay any part of the employer's business costs, my bad. So for example, part of running a business is dealing with customer theft, for example. Those are operating costs of running a business. So if a customer were to dine and dash, leave without paying, or if you work retail, they were shoplifting or whatever, that is, the employer cannot take that amount out of your wages. Nor can they ask you to pay for uniforms. This is really common. We see this a lot at WSN. Employers will ask for payment for uniforms. They'll ask for deposits for uniforms. And of course, if you're requiring your workers to wear uniforms at work, it is your obligation to provide them with the uniforms. And not only that, they're actually also required to pay for uniform maintenance. So if you're the uniform needs to be washed a certain way, they're also, they have to pay for it to be cleaned and maintained, so that it's ready and presentable, quote unquote, at work. And the same thing with broken dishes and glasses. This happens a lot, or any items really, if you ever worked in really any job, things break. But that is again part of running the cost of a business. And then besides like material things, they also can't deduce pay for poor work performance. If you're entitled to the wages that are stated in your contract, minimum wage and above, whatever your pay is, that is your rate of pay. And you can't, they can't deduce from your hourly wages for work performance. Pretty intuitive. So writing that shit down, it's a little bit less like straightforward than like regular wages. But you can think, I don't know if any of you have ever been charged or have been made to pay for something that is part of working. I know I've certainly had to pay for uniforms, and I only later realized that wasn't illegal. And in which case that is the case, then we always recommend that you write that down, right? So often you're not provided with like a receipt, like, right, if you're like getting a uniform, if you have to pay for a uniform at work, it's not like they're giving you a receipt. So writing down the cost of whatever it is you had to pay for, or whatever was taken out of your paycheck, also the date that it was deduced or taken out, basically just a record, how much you paid for, when, and what it was for. Yeah, that's one way to do it, I guess. So next I'm going to chat a little bit about overtime, something that I'm sure you folks have all heard of, but it might be kind of nebulous, like what are overtime entitlements, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all in that yellow box. Basically anytime in one day that you work over 8 hours, you need to be paid at time and a half your regular rate of pay. And if in that same day you work over 12 hours, so between 8 to 12 hours, it'll be 1.5 times time and a half your regular pay. And then anything over the 12-hour mark, so if you're working for 14 hours, those extra 2 hours after the 12 hours will be double your regular rate of pay. And then that's daily overtime. Weekly overtime is anytime you work over 40 hours in 1 week. So say you work 45 hours in 1 week, those extra 5 hours after the 40 hours will be paid at time and a half your regular rate of pay. It's rare that you may be exempt from overtime, but some specific types of work, and it is, employers like to say this a lot, but it is like truly very rare. But there are instances in which you can be exempt from overtime. Specific types of caregivers, domestic workers, as such are, and not even all types of domestic workers, like very specific types might be exempt from overtime, like if they live for the folks that they're taking care of. But in any case, chances are like you're entitled to overtime. And so the employer has to pay that on the paycheck in the pay period that you earned it. And sometimes, this has also happened to me at work. This is actually, unfortunately, kind of a common practice. Employers may have like a banking system, and technically that's allowed, but you have to request it. So it can be like imposed onto you. You can't, like, it's if you're working really hard 1 week and you want to take some time off later to make up for that, that is an agreement that you need to ask for and come to agreement with the employer. So the employer can't just be like, well, just take some time off later. It has to be an agreement. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah, great. So calculating your rate of pay. So imagine you're getting paid your wages are $20 an hour. And yeah, time and a half, $20 is $30 an hour. So if you work 1 hour of overtime with that, you're entitled to time and a half pay. Instead of $20, you'll be paid $30. After 12 hours, obviously it's doubled. So then instead of $20, you'll be paid $40. yeah, and then that's how you pay. The second is how salaries are paid out. So if your rate of pay is $800 on a salary at 40 hours per week, my bad, sorry. Then you can figure out what your like hourly rate of pay is. There is no difference between salaried employees and hourly workers. It's all the same. So you can do that by figuring out what your weekly salary is, dividing it by the hours that you normally work, or 40 hours in this case. And then anything above those hours, anything above $40, or 40 hours will be at double time. Or not double time, hour and a half. My bad. Time and a half. Yeah, and so that's how you determine your overtime rates. Yeah, so averaging agreements, I hinted at them earlier. All of the following conditions have to be present for an averaging agreement to work. So you can, in some instances, employers don't have to pay overtime. But all of the conditions that are in the listed in the bullet point have to be met. And this is basically to say you will be paid on average based on a certain amount of work that you do. And the first bullet point says the agreement must be temporary up to 4 weeks. So this isn't indefinite. Sometimes, for example, this is done during really busy seasons where workers are working a lot. I don't know, think the holidays, retail season. If these conditions are met, you can have an averaging agreement. It must be signed and agreed to by the worker prior to the start date. It must include all the shifts that are to take place during the agreement period. So if you're only working a certain amount of shifts, if you work an extra shift and that wasn't in the agreement, on that specific shift, you get paid overtime. And the hours work must average a maximum of 8 hours a day for a 1 week period, or 40 hours for a multiple week agreement. And then hours outside, yeah, as I mentioned, hours worked outside of the shift in the agreement are to be paid at the overtime rate. And yeah, hours over 12 hours in 1 day are paid at double time, the regular rate. Yeah, these are some common excuses that we hear that are illegal. Yeah, so you have to bank your overtime hours, as I said. Well, you don't have to bank your overtime hours. If you want to bank your overtime hours and you are consenting and asking for it as a worker, that's something, but they can't make you do it. We won't pay for overtime unless we approve it. They can't approve overtime. If you work overtime, you're entitled to overtime wages. It's not something that they get to decide. It's the law. We don't pay overtime. It's company policy. Company policy does not matter because the Employment Standards Act sets out the basic standard, the basic minimum rights that you're entitled to. So no employer can go below that. They can certainly go above it, and it's awesome when they do, but they can't go below it, even if it's company policy. Well, the company policy is not law. So yeah, you don't get paid overtime. You're a manager. In a lot of instances, folks will be given the title of manager without any managerial duties. I'll explain what banking overtime entails in a second. But I think there are very, very specific scenarios in which you as a manager will not be entitled to overtime, and that you actually fulfill managerial obligation, duties. And then the last one is you're not entitled to overtime. You're an independent contractor. Independent contractors are self-employed folks. So if you have your own business and you are your own boss, then no, you don't have to pay yourself overtime. But if you have a boss, and chances are, if you're being told you're an independent contractor, you have a boss, then you are entitled to overtime. Because you are not an independent contractor. In fact, you're likely misclassified. Yeah, I see Andrea's answering this question in the chat. Thank you for doing so. I appreciate it. Oh, I'm still next. That's so exciting. And the next is statutory holiday pay. This one I'm sure most folks are familiar with. So yeah, there are a number of days in the calendar year that are called statutory holidays: Christmas Day, Easter, that's the one coming out, Victoria Day, et cetera, et cetera. And on those days, if you've been employed for at least 30 calendar days prior to, and have worked and earned wages for 15 out of those 30 days, regardless of how much you've worked, if you've worked 15 out of the 30, you're entitled to statutory holiday pay on that day. So in a lot of instances, you may be given the day off, like you may not work on Christmas if your office isn't open, but it doesn't matter, because you're still entitled to basically an average day's pay using the formula of how much you're paid divided by the days work to find what an average day's work pay is. And it doesn't matter whether or not your day off is the stat pay. So say you don't work on Mondays normally, but the holiday happens to be on Monday, it doesn't matter, you get paid for it regardless. And then in the instances where you are required to work on stat holidays, certainly if you're a retail worker, you're working on most holidays because they tend to be really busy. You get paid time and a half your regular wage for the time worked for up to 12 hours. And then double your regular wages for any time worked over 12 hours. And then on top of that, you also get an average day's pay as is determined by the formula that I just mentioned. So you get paid time and a half, basically, if you're working under 12 hours. I see a question in the chat. Are temporary internship positions subject to statutory holiday pay rules after the 30-day period? I would say that if you're earning wages and are a worker, that yes, if it's a volunteer position and you're not earning wages, then likely not. But if your internship is paying you, then yes, all workers in BC that are covered by the Employment Standards Act, and most workers are, then you're entitled to stat pay. Does anybody else on the team want to tackle this question? Thoughts?
Yeah, as long as your type of work isn't under one of the exemptions of the Employment Standards Act, there's like a couple of types of work you could be doing that would exempt you from certain parts of the act. That's unlikely, but as long as you're not covered by those and you're not unionized, you're covered by the Employment Standards Act, the same thing would apply to you after 30 days. So what Nikki said.
Oh, second question. Oh, hold on. So for working on stat holidays, you get time and a half for what you do plus the full day stat pay on top of it. Yes, that's right. So if you work an 8-hour day, you get paid your regular 8-hour wages on top of the time and a half for the 8 hours that you've worked. Yeah, these were good questions. Thank you all for asking them. Substituting stat holidays. Yeah, so an employer, this is actually something I learned relatively recently, but they actually, an employer may, for one or more workers, substitute another day off for a stat holiday pay if both the employer and the worker or a majority of those workers agree to the substitution. And the reason is not all workers celebrate all holidays. So if you do not celebrate Christmas, you can take another holiday of your choice off in lieu. But that is, again, it's an agreement that needs to be reached between both the worker and the employer. But regardless, whatever substitution you're making, it doesn't matter. You have the same rights under the Act. Regardless of the substitution, you have the same duties, and so does your employer. And the employers are required to retain the records of this for 4 years. Yeah, so you still get paid time and a half. Write that shit down. Yes, that pay is actually reflected on your pay stubs. If you have correct pay stubs, sometimes actually often workers don't. But if you have correct pay stubs, it should be reflected there. If you don't, keep a record. Actually, regardless, I would say keep a record of the stat holidays that you've worked, and how many hours you worked, if you worked, and then make sure that you've actually been paid for your regular day's wages as well. Anyways, I'll pass it to Andrea.
Awesome. Thanks, Nikki. So I'm going to talk a little bit about compensation for length of service. Compensation for length of service, or sometimes we call it CLOS because it's shorter, is your employer's minimum obligation to you when they end the employment. So if they fire you or lay you off, or if something called deemed termination happens, which I'll go into in a bit. So there are minimum requirements of pay or notice that's set out by the Employment Standards Act. It's kind of like severance. It's basically severance. You can use those terms interchangeably. If an employer's policies or if your employment agreement has provision for severance or compensation on termination of employment that's higher than what the Employment Standards Act provides, then the Employment Standards Branch will enforce that higher standard. So either they can enforce your minimum requirements for CLOS, or if your employer offers more in a contract, they can enforce that as well. Compensation for length of service is a type of wages like overtime and vacation pay. So it's not necessarily like an award for damages if you were to sue for wrongful termination. It's a type of wages that you earn. You earn these wages throughout your employment as soon as you've completed 3 months of service. So as soon as you worked somewhere for 3 months, you start to be eligible for compensation for length of service. And the way you earn these wages is just by showing up to work every day. And the longer your employment is, the more you're entitled to on termination. If your employer terminates your employment as well, they have to pay you everything they owe you within 48 hours. And this includes your CLOS as well. So again, to be eligible for CLOS, your employment is terminated by your employer without just cause and without notice equivalent to the same number of weeks of pay you earned, or if your employment is deemed terminated. So for the notice, let's say because you've worked somewhere for 2 years, your employer might have to pay you 2 weeks. If they've given you a week of notice, as long as they're paying you appropriately, they haven't cut your hours or anything like that, you're getting the same pay you would through your termination entitlements, then that combination of notice and pay can work together to kind of make up that 2 weeks. Could be 1 week notice, 1 week pay, could be 2 weeks notice or 2 weeks of pay. Awesome. I see a question. Is the same if I am in a permanent position or a contract position? Yes, as long as you're an employee, and not a contractor, this will apply to you if you're covered by the Employment Standards Act. Again, you just have to have worked somewhere for a minimum of 3 months. So if your contract is less than 3 months, that might not happen. If the termination is happening at the end of your contract, if your employment's ended because your contract term is ended, then you would not be, then the employment would be considered to be terminated basically by the contract and not by the employer. So the employer has to terminate. If you're terminated in the middle of your contract, then you would still be entitled. Awesome. So there are a couple of exceptions, which I've mentioned very briefly at the start. And the first exception is just cause, which I'm sure is a term a lot of us have heard before. Employers love to claim just cause at the smallest thing, but just cause is actually a pretty high standard that the employers have to meet. So just cause is a set of circumstances where the employer is exempt from their liability to provide pay or notice to terminate your employment. The baseline presumption is that you are owed CLOS or severance, and the employer has to rebut that if they say that you have just cause. So they're the ones that have to prove it and not you. There are two types of just cause. The first is progressive discipline. So this is where the conduct doesn't have to be extremely serious. It has to be significant, but it doesn't have to be extreme. But the employer has to meet strict requirements of documentation to show that they've done what they reasonably can to train you, to make you aware of the conduct of the standard that they have, provide you with training, and to make it clear that failure to meet expectations will result in termination. This also means that if in the employer communicating a specific standard, maybe a company policy or something to you, they have to be enforcing that consistently, both with you as the employer who might be told you were fired for a just cause, but also with the other employees at the workplace. So for example, if you happen to be late a couple of times and and then the employer writes you up, takes all the steps and fires you, but it turns out the employer was not applying the same rule to other people, even though they've done the write-ups, the documentation, they may not have been found to have just cause to terminate you. The single incident just cause means that a single incident of conduct from the employee, you can do something if it's bad enough, just a one-time incident can be just cause, but the threshold for that is really, really high. So in progressive discipline, the conduct doesn't have to be very serious, and the focus is on how much the employer has done to try to kind of fix it. And the second one is the focus is on how bad or egregious the conduct is. So it has to be like serious fraud or theft or something like that. And they could say that that constitutes just cause. A couple of things for single incident just cause as well is that it has to be what they call willful and deliberate. So it can't be something that you didn't know or negligence, for example. The second exception is deemed termination. This happens if your employer makes a big change to your job, your contract, your pay, your benefit, without notice and without your consent. You may still be entitled to CLAWS even if you quit, as long as you quit because of those changes your employer made. So this is what's called deemed termination, meaning the employer's conduct is considered to have actually ended the employment. They're saying when your employer cut your hours significantly, for example, that's what ended the employment. When you quit, you were just acknowledging you didn't want this new employment with new conditions. So it's kind of like, you can think about it a little bit as like quitting with cause, if that helps to put it in some context. So if it is, yeah, constructive dismissal, if you were to go to small claims or to court for constructive dismissal, it's a very, very similar thing. But like with many other things, the Employment Standards Branch can recover your minimum entitlements, like your compensation for length of service. And court, for example, in a constructive dismissal claim, you could recover more. But yes, correct. So the Employment Standards Branch looks at kind of three things. If you were deemed terminated, or you think that you may have been deemed terminated and you want to recover your termination pay, these are kind of three things that you'll have to show that the branch will be looking for. The first is whatever changed, whatever the thing was that changed, that had to be a significant condition of employment. So this includes like stuff that was written in your contract or stuff there's evidence for, like your rate of pay or your job title, but also stuff that's implied, which is not written down anywhere. And that can include stuff that was established through regular practice that became an expectation. Maybe you don't have a contract that guarantees you a certain amount of hours, but you've been working a certain amount of hours for the last 2 years. If that gets significantly changed, that's still considered to be a condition of employment, even though it's not written down anywhere. And implied or implicit conditions of employment can also include like your right to a safe and secure workplace, your right to be free from discrimination at work. So sometimes just, your employer having to uphold their legal obligations. The second part is once you've established that you have a significant condition, a minor condition might be, sometimes it can be just a very small change in hours or a very small change in responsibilities or so a lifestyle changes generally don't tend to be accepted as fundamental conditions. The change has to be without your consent, and it has to be done by the employer. So you might have to show that you didn't agree to a change. That standard isn't very high. If you just say, I went up to my employer and I was like, hey, what happened to my hours? Sometimes that can be enough to show that you didn't want that change to happen. Sometimes if your employer got you to sign off on something, that doesn't necessarily mean that you consented as well. So if you're in that position, it might still be worth having a go. In cases where part one, the significant condition refers to an employer not meeting their legal obligations, like they haven't been paying you or you've been subject to discrimination or harassment, it may be assumed that you didn't consent. So you may not have to do a whole bunch of work to show that you didn't consent to it. It's kind of implied. And the third point is that the change itself has to be significant. So a small change to a significant condition of employment won't be enough, or a big change to an insignificant condition of employment won't be enough. So it has to be a significant condition, significant change. Whether or not a change is significant takes a look at the circumstances of each situation. There's no overall rule. It just kind of looks at how it's impacted you and what you reasonably ought to have expected. When it comes to changes in pay, relatively small changes in pay have been found to be significant as well. I know I saw an example fairly recently where a 10% change in pay was found to constitute deemed termination. Now those exceptions aside, assuming that you're entitled to compensation for length of service, how you calculate it, it's pretty easy. First is after 3 months, you're entitled to 1 week of pay. 1 and 2 years, 2 weeks of pay, and then it increases by 1 week every year until 8. And then after 8 years, however long you've been there, your minimum entitlements remain at 8 weeks of pay. The way that you figure out a week's worth of pay for the purpose of compensation for length of service is by having a look at the most recent 8 weeks of work, or if you're getting pay stubs, if you're getting paid every 2 weeks, your last 4 pay stubs. And as long as you've been working your regular hours during that time, you can just add everything you earned up and divide it by 8, and that's your 1 week of pay. And then you just multiply that by as many weeks as you're entitled to. If it happens that you are on a leave or your hours were cut or something like that in a certain week, you would not include that week in the calculations. You want to make sure that you're including time periods where you've earned your regular wages. And you also want to include everything, not just your regular pay. If you earned overtime, stat holiday pay, vacation pay, all of that adds up to your calculation. And that also includes things like commissions, for example, and bonuses. Awesome. So that was quite a bit of information about compensation for length of service. Now to have a bit of a look at vacation pay. So your employers have to give you at least 4% vacation pay. If you've worked at the same place for more than 5 years, it has to be 6%. What that correlates to is 4% adds up to 2 weeks and 6% adds up to 3 weeks of pay. Your employer has to let you take your vacation. They don't have to accept every single vacation request that they get, but they have to make sure that you can take your vacation throughout a given year. And they're not allowed to ask you to divide your vacation time in time periods smaller than 1 week at a time. You can decide to do that, but your employer has to let you take your vacation at least 1 week at a time. You become entitled to vacation really early on. After 5 days, you're already earning vacation. So how that works is, let's say you show up to work one day for 8 hours, whatever you earn in that day, an additional 4% is what you earn in vacation. And then at the end of the year, that adds up to 2 weeks of pay. If you quit, your employer has to pay you your vacation within 6 days, whatever you haven't used yet. And if your employer fires you, lays you off, if you're deemed terminated, they have to pay you within 48 hours. Awesome. So your vacation pay calculations, if you are trying to figure out if you were paid all of your vacation pay or how much you should have earned, you can have a look at what you've earned so far this year. You may not have worked somewhere for a whole year, so that's okay. Your regular wages, your overtime, stat holiday, compensation for length of service if your employment ended and you were paid that, or you earned that. And you take the total and multiply it by 0.04 if you're at 4%, 0.06 if you are at 6%. And that'll be the amount of vacation that you earned. And that's how much you should have been paid. If you've already been paid some vacation, you can subtract what you were already paid to figure out what you're still entitled to. Sometimes on your pay stubs, you'll see your vacation accrued. There will be a section that will show that. Assuming that it's accurate, that should be, if you if you haven't taken any vacation yet, for example, towards the end of the year, it should be looking like closer to 2 weeks of pay. Your pay stubs, if they're accurate, should show you how much vacation you've taken and how much vacation you still have. But using these calculations, you can double check if that's correct. And if your pay stubs don't have that, then you can just figure out what your vacation is. Awesome. So I'll talk briefly about filing a complaint with the Employment Standards Branch. I just want to take a second before I do, in case I know I went through a lot just now. If anybody has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, or we'll wrap up shortly and go over it. So if if you feel like you are owed wages, or you think you might be owed wages, or your employer's contravened the ESA, you can file a complaint with Employment Standards BC. You have to be an employee, you have to be in BC, you have to not be unionized and not federally regulated. If your work is federally regulated, you can still recover wages, but you go through a different process. So most workers are covered by Employment Standards. You have 6 months to file a complaint. So let's say you quit your job, you weren't paid everything, you have to make sure to put that complaint in before 6 months. Otherwise, you'll probably lose your ability to recover that money through the branch. And the recovery period means when the branch takes your complaint, how far back can they go to recover your wages for you, or whatever the case may be. And that's a year back. If you're still working there, it's just a year back from when you filed the complaint. But let's say you quit and 6 months later you file your complaint, the 1 year period still goes back from it's your last year of employment. And it's helpful to know, it's inconvenient, but helpful to know there's quite a bit of a wait for the branch to have a look at your complaint. And right now it's a big range, but between 6 to 12 months before they see it. So if you are looking to file an employment standards complaint, you might be wondering what kind of evidence you could have. Oh, I see a question. I can just answer that now. Can we be paid hourly pay for a casual tutor job on a monthly basis? Do you mean, I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. You're being paid once a month, you're working an hourly job and you're only getting paid once a month? Is that? Yeah. Okay. So your employer has to pay you, your employer actually has to pay you at least twice a month. So generally bi-weekly is yeah. So if they're only paying you once a month and you're covered by the Employment Standards Act, they might be doing something that they're not supposed to be doing.
So it's a casual job, and we are paid for the number of hours we work. In that case, employers are supposed to pay bi-weekly, not monthly.
Okay, yeah.
I'm asking, sorry. Is that so?
You have to be paid for all of the hours that you've worked, kind of no matter what. You said, sorry, did you say it was a government job?
No. I meant no, not a government job. It's just a private tutor. So the thing is, so if we are paid for the number of hours we work, which is not a full-time job, not a part-time job, it's like 10 hours a week.
Yeah.
So we're supposed to be paid bi-weekly and not monthly.
Yes. Yeah. You should still be being paid bi-weekly. If you wanted to have a look at the Employment Standards Act, like if you wanted a point of reference, I'm sure that I can find that for you right now. It's kind of towards the beginning, and it'll tell you the details of what you're entitled to. It is in Part 3, Payment of Wages. You can even find. Here's the Employment Standards Act, or a link to it in the chat. I just put in there. If you scroll down to Part 3, or if you look at the table of contents and you just click on it, Section 17 is where it says that your employer has to pay you, semi-monthly, like twice a month.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. So yeah, I know Nikki and Pam spoke a lot about writing that shit down and what you want to keep track of and document. And so if you've had a chance to do some of that, that's going to come in really handy at this point. And oh, there we go. You can include your employment agreement, any company policies, text messages, emails, all of that kind of stuff, schedules, wage statements. The Employment Standards Branch is always going to want to see how many hours you worked and what you got paid. But a lot of the times employers don't provide you with formal schedules or with pay stubs, even though they're, especially with pay stubs, they're supposed to. So what you can do in those scenarios is you can do something like, have a look at old bank statements and figure out how much you were paid. And when it comes to hours of work, you can even lay out a calendar and to the best of your ability, just write in what you think you worked. As long as you clarify that it's an estimate and then you explain how you arrived at that estimate, that's still going to be valid in a complaint. So if you don't have a formal record of your hours work, don't worry, you're still good to go. Just make sure that you include something, even an approximation. And then you can also include statements about what happened. You can include details about who, where, when, what happened. Your statements should be about events that you were present for, or you experienced directly whenever possible. And you can also include witness statements for events where somebody else was present, like a coworker or even a member of the public. Awesome.
That's a great question. Poppy asked a great question in the chat.
Yeah. Can we not be paid for training at work? So the most common answer to that question is no. And where that comes from is how the branch looks at whether or not something is work. So if the training is for the benefit of the employer, if you're doing training for them to continue working for them, to the branch, that's just time worked. They don't care what you do while you're at work. So as long as you're at work, you have to be paid. In order to not be paid for training, it has to be something like educational, like through your university or something. But aside from that, yeah, you should be getting paid just your regular wages for any time that you do training. That's a common one too. We hear that a lot, that employers don't pay for training. Vulnerable worker open work permit. So this is just for folks who are temporary foreign workers that are on a closed permit. So if your status in Canada is tied to your employer, you are still, entitled to employment standards protections, but sometimes it's not that straightforward. You need to find another job, whatever might be the case. I'll just very briefly go into the vulnerable worker open work permit, which states basically the conditions for being eligible as if you've experienced some kind of abuse at work. And that can be financial, psychological, physical, anything like that. A lot of the times, for example, repeated violations of employment standards or human rights, those are enough to show that. And you still have a work permit of some kind, or implied status. You can apply, and a successful application will basically open up your work permit for a period of 12 months so that you can try to find another job and kind of leave that situation. If you are successful, but let's say 12 months from now, you're still looking for another job, you can reapply. And as long as the conditions for eligibility are still present, then you'll just be granted that again. You can apply online. If you look up temporary, the title of the slide, Vulnerable Worker Open Work Permit, you can apply online. It's completely free. And you can also apply as many times as you need to. We always recommend that you can get some legal support with this if you can, just because it makes things a little bit easier. But that's just an option for folks if you're in a position where you can't very easily leave your job and address your rights at work. And just very briefly, there are different kinds of protected leave in the Employment Standards Act. So this is not necessarily to do with wages. If you're having a look at the Employment Standards Act, I did share a link to it actually in the chat just now. So feel free to have a look. Under Part 6, that's going to list all of your different types of protected leave. So I haven't included all of them here. But they include, sick days, maternity, parental leave, leave respecting domestic and sexual violence, jury duty. There's a whole big list. The majority of the time, those leaves are unpaid, but they're protected in the sense that your employer has to give you those leaves if you qualify for it and if you ask for it. And they're not allowed to terminate you or change a condition of employment on you without your written consent because of a protected leave. Because you went on one, because you're coming back from one, whatever the case may be. And as soon as the leave ends, if you go on a protected leave, the employer has to place you in a position that you held before, or maybe that position is not available or something like that. They have to put you in a comparable position, like a similar enough position as well. So yeah, you can refer to Part 6 of the Employment Standards Act to see all the different lists, all the different leaves, and it'll also tell you how to know if you're eligible. But just for the purpose of saving a bit of time, no matter what leave you're on, your employer can't change your employment or terminate you because of it, and they have to allow you to take the leave. And kind of just to wrap things up, you're also protected from retaliation. You might experience retaliation at work for speaking up about your rights, for filing a complaint, or maybe your employer is just afraid that you might file a complaint. This can include termination or even threats of termination, reduction in wages, intimidation, any kind of negative effect that's connected to you addressing your employment standards rights at work, whether it's through a complaint or asking questions or anything like that. You don't have to prove that your employer intended to retaliate, because they often do just say that they didn't intend to do that. All you have to do is to show that in your specific circumstances, it was reasonable for you to make a connection between acting in the employer's interest and avoiding some kind of negative consequence. So for example, if your employer is, you may have drawn a connection between not asking for your overtime pay and the employer not cutting your hours, something like that, which is a little bit easier to meet than to just like prove 100% that your employer meant to retaliate and that's what they were doing. Just showing that a reasonable person would make that connection is enough. So given everything that we've discussed today, if you find yourself considering or filing an employment standards complaint, what can you get out of it? And there's a few things you can get out of it. The primary thing is you can just recover your wages. If you're owed wages of any kind, any of the ones that we've talked about today, you can recover them through the employment standards complaint process. In certain cases, like for example, retaliation or those protected leaves that we talked about, if your employer does something sketchy there, the branch can award something called a make-whole remedy. And the make-whole remedy is not wages, but it's meant to make up for any kind of loss that you suffered as a result. So maybe if your employer fired you because of retaliation, you might find that the branch makes the employer pay you all the wages that you could have earned until you find another job, that kind of thing. So that's a pretty broad power that the branch has. And that's, yeah, for retaliation and protected leave. And sometimes the branch can require an employer to change a certain policy if the policy is unlawful. And if you, throughout the employment standards process, if there's the opportunity to have a settlement at any point, but if you make it all the way to the end and you have a formal decision, the employer is going to have to pay you interest, and they're going to have to pay the branch a fine of $500 for each contravention, so each section of the Employment Standards Act that they didn't follow. So I think that's it. I think that was a lot of content. Thank you so much for listening. And yeah, I think we'll pass it off if there's, we're a little bit over time, if there's any questions or anything like that.
Thank you. Yeah, we are a little bit over, but that's okay because there's so much information there. It's very jam-packed. We're really appreciative. So yeah, there's some contact details on the screen, and I will also email out an email address for both of our organizations if you'd like to reach out with any questions. We had lots today, so it seems like it was really great. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, just want to thank you all for those attending and Worker Solidarity Network. And yeah, that's it for today. All right, thanks. Bye, everyone.